Thank you so much for coming along today to this wonderful fringe event, the ALP National Conference. Topic being Public Sector Reform, a Challenge for Government. My name's Sarah Howe. I'm the newly elected National Chair, based in Melbourne, but up here in Brisbane for this conference. And I'm very delighted to be here. So I want to begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land and extend my respect to the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples today, acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and waters upon which we work, live and sustain ourselves in the Brisbane region from the Yagara and Turrbal people. The Australian Fabians for more than half a century have been at the forefront of research and debate into progressive political ideas and public policy reform. I think I can speak for everyone here to say how excited we are at the Fabians that we have such a progressive Labor government in place at the moment at the federal level after years in opposition. I first met Julian at Monash University Labor Club. We're not going to talk about the details.
1990s, do they?
No. So we won't trawl over the details of what we got up to at the Monash Labor Club, but we have known each other for a long time, so I'm delighted that he's on our panel today. Thanks, Julian. And also delighted to have Andrew Leigh here as well. He's been a long-term Fabians member and supporter of our organisation. In terms of the session today, we're just going to have two 10-minute spiels from our two speakers. We're going to be fairly relaxed and informal. We want to have a Q&A as the main sort of agenda item because the Fabians are all about democratic involvement of the members, so we want to hear, what you've got to say about the topic. So Andrew is going to speak first, is that right? On the topic of how the Australian Centre for Evaluation will help inequality reduce. Sorry.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sarah. Can I acknowledge the meeting on traditional lands, the Jagera and Turrbal people, and pay respects to elders past and present, to any Indigenous people present, and in doing so, commit myself to a successful referendum at the end of the year. It really is beautiful traditional land. I went for a run along the Maiwar River this morning. Just a reminder of how lucky we are to live on these lands that have been occupied by traditional owners for over 60,000 years. The remarks I want to give today fit very much in the tradition of the Fabian Society. As you know, the Fabian Society is that unusual thing, a social democratic organisation named after a military leader. Fabius, of course, had the motto of moving slowly in order to win success. And I think that characterises the way in which the Albanese government has approached coming to office. We haven't looked to rush into office with a big bang set of policy reforms that will terrify everyone and shake up the world. We've looked at moving to have the Australian people moving with us to lock in long-term Labor majorities. If there was one message coming out of the Prime Minister's speech on Thursday, it was that enduring reform takes time and requires governments that last. And I think there's often no better way of epitomising that than what we're trying to do with evaluation. Working steadily to try and improve the quality of government for everyone, but particularly for the most disadvantaged. When government works badly, then the super rich turn to their private options, to private security, private hospitals, private schools. They opt out of the public sector. It's the most vulnerable that are hurt when government works badly. And so therefore it's critical for social democrats to ensure that government works as well as possible. I want to argue today that good evaluation is one of those things, and that it's characterised by one of the features that have often been noted about technologies. That transformative technologies often underwhelm in the short run and overwhelm in the long run. That steady tweaks to how we do government can actually pay massive dividends over the long run. In thinking about evaluation, we're always thinking about the counterfactual. What would have happened if we hadn't put the intervention in place? And for this, I want you to imagine that we're interested in testing the following proposition. Does giving everyone in this room a cup of coffee make you more likely to remember the brilliant points that Julian will make in his talk? Now, we could test that in two ways. We could say we're going to survey the people in this room and ask who's had a cup of coffee and who hasn't had a cup of coffee. And then we're going to compare the two groups, the people that had the coffee and the people that didn't. I'm sure you can immediately see the problems with this. The group of people who've just had a coffee might have had a coffee because they woke up, got out of bed with a real energy, knowing that they were going to hear Julian's words of wisdom this morning. That excitement might have propelled them to grab a cup of coffee and they would have learned more regardless. Or maybe the reverse selection problem takes place. Maybe those who chose to have a cup of coffee this morning did so because they were exhausted, they were bone tired, they slept badly last night, and they've had a cup of coffee to try and keep up. In that case, we'd expect the coffee drinkers to already be the kinds of people who might struggle to remember Julian's pearls of wisdom. And so a simple evaluation approach that evaluated the impact of coffee on memory by looking at those who selected to buy a cup of coffee with those who selected not to buy a cup of coffee simply wouldn't capture the true effect of coffee on memory. How would we do the experiment? Well, it's pretty easy to imagine. We have someone at the back of the room handing out random cups of regular coffee and decaf. We remember who got what, we quiz them afterwards, and then we can test the impact of getting a caffeinated coffee on remembering Julian's brilliant talk. That's the kind of randomised trial which is common when we're evaluating pharmaceuticals. If you want to get a new drug in the pharmaceutical benefits register, you've got to put it through a randomised trial. When COVID came along, we didn't simply say, hey, let's see what they've got in the lab and let's just stick that into people's arms. No, we ran careful randomised trials. Sometimes treatments that seemed like they would work well turned out not to be effective. Hydroxychloroquine looked good in a low-quality evaluation, but in high-quality evaluations turned out not to work. The UQ vaccine looked promising until it turned out it was turning up false positives for HIV tests. It was only through doing these careful randomised trials we were able to work out which were the most efficacious vaccines. Now, that idea of randomisation has been used occasionally in public policy. In 1999, in the face of a heroin epidemic and the power of the Sydney shock jocks, Bob Carr wanted to put in place a drug court, a system in which those who were suffering from drug addiction and had committed crimes didn't just get locked up in jail, but actually got sentenced by a magistrate who understood their addiction problems and put them through an addiction program. The trouble was he wanted really good evidence in order to see whether or not this worked. And so Bob turned to a randomised trial. Half the people that went to the court went through the traditional criminal justice process, half went to the drug court. A year later, they followed up and looked at offending behaviour. What was striking about it was that those who'd gone to the drug court were less likely to offend. They were less likely, in particular, to commit drug offences. You actually didn't have to care about the well-being of people who are addicted to drugs to support the drug court. It was enough to see that it was reducing the risk of crime for the community. And that gave the New South Wales government the ability to roll out drug courts across the state. Sometimes randomised trials don't produce the results that we hope to see. A recent study of 10 different job training programs in the United States found that 9 out of 10 didn't produce earnings boosts at the 6-year mark. One of the reasons for this is that job training is actually pretty hard to do well. The people who are offered the training have to take it up. It has to be applicable to their work. Employers have to value the job training. Turned out there was one program that worked. A program called Year Up was producing earnings gains around $7,000 a year. But for most US job training programs, subject to a rigorous evaluation, 9 out of 10 failed. 9 out of 10, you say, that's not a very good hit rate. But it turns out that that's what medicine faces. If you look at 10 drugs coming out of the lab, only one of those 10 will pass through phase 1, 2, 3 randomised trials and get onto the market. That's not because people designing job training programs and people designing pharmaceuticals are foolish or haven't read the evidence or are unethical. It's simply because they're dealing with really hard problems. So our Australian Centre for Evaluation, established with a budget of $10 million over 4 years and 14 staff, is going to be conducting randomised trials in the heart of government, trying to bring a little dose of science to what we do in evaluating programs. You shouldn't see this as being stepping away from the passion and the vigour to solve social problems. In fact, it's the reverse. I care deeply about poverty and disadvantage. Probably no issue has animated what I've talked, thought and written about over my career. But I don't believe that it serves the most disadvantaged to be rolling out programs that don't work. So that's why we're raising the evidence bar, setting up the Australian Centre for Evaluation and looking to build a stronger culture of evaluation right across government. Thanks very much for listening. Hope you enjoy a good cup of coffee afterwards.
Thanks, Andrew. That was terrific. So thanks very much. We'll have an opportunity to ask questions later. But I will now hand over to Julian Hill. I'm not doing big introductions. Is that all right? I did have one, but I think everyone's got that in their fringe publication, people's backgrounds. So I'll just announce what Julian's going to speak about, which is he's going to speak on the first principles review of Australia's employment services system.
Sure. I was scared you were going to say something different. Thanks, Sarah. And I've known both of you since the 1990s, actually. It's scary. The young folks in the room, this is what you have to look forward to. You two can be sitting here in 25 years on a stage in a windowless room, chatting with people you've known forever.
Could be a lot worse.
It could be a lot worse. About really cool ideas. Thank you. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners, and in having a bit of a chat about employment services as one case study of potential public sector reform, you have to acknowledge the deep structural barriers, regional locality barriers and many individual lenses of disadvantage that Indigenous job seekers face across the country. The data's stark. And if we're serious about trying to improve outcomes from Australia's employment services system, then dealing with our Indigenous brothers and sisters and better supporting them and tailoring services by listening to people and looking at the evidence of what works has to be a priority. Thanks too for Andrew. I should also acknowledge that Andrew's the Assistant Minister for Employment Services and will be deploying his formidable intellect. He writes a book every question time, astounding, deploying his formidable intellect onto some of the challenges that we're identifying through this inquiry, as well as the methodology that he's just sort of hinted at there, and his passion for research and evidence-based policy to this area of public policy over the next couple of years and try and make sense of whatever report we put out. So what I thought I might do, I am the chair of the House Select Committee. I'm going to be a little constrained in what I say because we're a committee of the Parliament. I'm a member of the government, but I'm not a member of the executive. And so we will finalise our report by the end of November, and I'm not going to preempt what the findings may be. We're in that sort of phase now where this inquiry one day will end. It's been going for about a year. Where we can sort of see the home stretch, but we're now at the sort of almost panic stage in my mind about pulling a report together. So what I thought I might do is just make a series of observations about Australia's employment services system and use them to set the scene for the discussion. On so many measures, you would have to conclude that the system has not worked as well as it should over recent years, or indeed the last couple of decades. We have the biggest data point of that right now is we have a red hot labour market in Australia with employers screaming out for workers right across the country, and yet long-term unemployment is higher than it was before COVID. Now, a whole bunch of reasons for that, won't go into them, but there is a giant mismatch between people who are unemployed and seeking work and the kind of jobs on offer. There's many peculiarities around Australia's system. One of which I think it's fair to say from the evidence we've received And I think this is a point which broadly would resonate with employment service providers, with those who study the system, and with people who have experienced or are experiencing the system. We've designed the system around the very worst people in society and the very worst providers. It's absolutely operating in a deficit paradigm, and everyone else gets lumped into that paradigm. And somewhere along the way, we seem to have lost touch in the language that we use and the way we think about this, that this is fundamentally a human service, and that humans have to be at the centre of this service. The employment services for so many Australians are actually a gateway to the broader human service ecosystem. Particularly in this labour market, there's usually a reason why people are not in work or able to get into work. Putting aside those who are frankly just poor and transit through the system for a short period of time, hopefully not a long period of time because they just need a bit of income support. The second observation I'd make is that a lot of this deficit paradigm seems to be driven by a flawed theory of unemployment which underpins the system. The myth of the dole bludger. It was the Royal Commissioner into Robo-Debt. Royal Commissioner stated in the front of her report, to paraphrase, I haven't got the quote here, politicians and indeed every citizen in society needs to really move away from this false binary of taxpayer versus social security recipient. It does our society no good, but it has served particularly conservative politicians, although every side of politics at time has been guilty of using that stereotype to varying degrees. But the vast majority of people want to work. As the OECD said, and I think I'm visiting the committee later in September in Paris, we've engaged with a range of countries there. Incentive to work in Australia overwhelmingly is not the issue because the rate of our social security payments provide a very strong incentive for people to work. Now, there are a number of people, a percentage, who, I think I've used the language before and everyone trolls me, colloquially taking the piss, working cash, and so on. At one level, you do have to be rational and go, well, if in any human society, in any big system, some people cheat. But we've designed the whole system around that small percentage of people, and arguably a lot of the evidence that we're receiving is that we're actually making most people, or many people, less employable because of what we do to them. So, as someone who's been around the system for a long time said, we're now using a nuclear bomb to kill a mosquito. So it's something we really need to think about. And it's a prime reason, this conundrum, why I think the Minister wanted a bunch of politicians to do this work rather than very clever consultants or academics or experts, because they're values judgments which society is going to need to make. The characteristics of unemployed people in the country at the moment, they're incredibly diverse, but a couple of things that stand out. Most people actually have identifiable barriers. At any point in time, 10% or more of people are just sick. They're just poor and they're sick. So they're doing chemo or they're recovering from accidents, but they receive job seeker. 28% of people roughly have some kind of a disability. 20% only have a partial capacity to work. 28% are doing some part-time work. And many of those are actually making a very rational choice, particularly single parents, to work as much as they can, but not lose the last few dollars of payment because they don't want to lose their healthcare card, or in some states they might get kicked out of their social housing, or they've got kids with needs. So there's a whole range of complex questions about incentives and disincentives to work. So we can get stuck on the headline number, as Peter Dutton loves to do, but you've got to scratch into it. And a lot of people, as we know, and we know them, we have them in our families, we have them in our communities, they visit our offices. They have profound barriers, be they psychosocial issues, personality issues, transient or episodic mental health issues, intellectual limitations, legacies of substance abuse disorders. I'm not meaning to stereotype everyone on job seeker, but this is part of our human reality. And I think for too long we haven't found a language in our public policy and public reform conversations about talking about that. The first principles review means that one of the common definitions of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So since John Howard abolished the CES back in 1998, there's a lot of rose-coloured glasses stuff about the CES and so on. We've got to be clear-eyed. You go back to some of the Senate debates and reviews and stuff, and of course it wasn't perfect. Many of the problems that plague the current system were also reported in the previous system and indeed reported in every system in the world, because these problems are not new to human society. Indeed, they're hundreds of years old. I made a speech last year which traced some of this back to the debates in Victorian England about the British Poor Laws and what to do with the problem of the unemployed. Societies make these judgments because there will always be some level of frictional, unfortunately some structural, and we can do better, level of unemployment, as well as the ups and downs of economic cycles. So a few things just to sort of seed the discussion. We've chosen largely as a country a very narrow set of objectives for our system. $7.5 billion of contracts, the largest single procurement the Commonwealth makes outside defence, and we've largely seemed to have chosen a work test objective. That's a choice. Other countries do make different choices. We could choose a more robust labour exchange function. We could choose a human capital or skills development function. We could choose a workforce participation agenda. We could choose an economic security agenda. And your point about boost to earnings, maybe we could look at those kinds of things to evaluate what kind of system we want, particularly as we look at what kind of society we'll be and what kind of labour market we'll have over the next 10 to 20 years. The nature and extent of mutual obligations is a question that we have to put on the table, that is on the table. The international evidence is pretty clear that some level of activation and requirements are necessary to keep people engaged and motivated. You don't want people to just fall out of society. But we're also getting very compelling evidence that the nature and extent of the current mutual obligations, as I said, makes people less employable. So we're going to confront that. Work for the dole is a bit of an eye-opener. It's not even, put aside the offensive name, it's not even the system that people might think it is from when John Howard created it, doing useful community projects. It's just something that's completely bastardised and different. Supply-demand. Our system, because of the work test function, is almost entirely focused on the notion that if only you push unemployed people, condition supply ever harder, then somehow magically they'll get a job. It ignores structural barriers, it ignores thin labour markets, it ignores lack of skills, it ignores all of those other characteristics which I talked about, and it doesn't work. That's not to say that there shouldn't be some requirements. I know that's a contested view and people have their views, but it is to say that our system is very unbalanced and has very little connection left to employers. Under 10% of employers in Australia use our publicly funded employment services. They got the jobs. So we've got to have a think about demand, which also includes social procurement and a range of other demands sort of linked levers. It's unbalanced. Our market structure is probably the thing that attracts most controversy along with mutual obligations. But let's be clear, form follows function. So we can have arguments about public provision and not-for-profit provision and private provision. Those arguments have to exist in a broader policy context, which is what we're trying to think through. And look, people have their views, happy to talk about that. There is compelling evidence that there is too much competition in the system and that the benefits of contestability and the benefits of choice have not been realised because of a lot of the market design issues. And local not-for-profits, people with social capital. Social capital's a thing, people who have relationships in communities. Some of that goes to market design, some of it goes to system design, some of it goes to crazy procurement decisions. But I've been to Cairns, we hear from Geelong. There's regions in the country where in the last round, every single provider got shot. Like all that social capital, all those relationships gone, all the offices closed, they moved down the street, we changed the IT, the taxpayer pays for all of this. And businesses are going, we don't know any of these people, we're starting from scratch. It's a very peculiar system that is now driven by procurement needs far more than a rational policy. So I think there's some of the things. Just one other thing I wanted to mention, workforce. Australia spends, we've got the analysis done from the Parliamentary Budget Office, it's pretty complex, but they've done it, about half the OECD average on active labour market programs. So there's one thing you can say for the Australian system, it's really cheap. And it's actually pretty good at people close to the labour market. It doesn't seem to be that good for people furthest from the labour market, but it is now, over the last 25 years, has largely become low skilled, it's improved a little bit in the last 2 or 3 years, I think, but it's largely from where it was, a low skilled, deprofessionalised, deunionised, mainly female dominated, low paid sector. Ooh, another one of those. And so we have a choice to make as a society. If we think we can get better outcomes, what are we going to spend on this? Do we value it? And how do we rebuild some of that professionalism and capability in the right places over time? So there's some really big questions. It is an outlier system. And the very final thing I'd say is everyone says it's fully privatised. Actually, the largest single provider now in the system is the government from the new digital caseload as of last July. I think there's a mindset shift which the government department need to make to view themselves as the largest provider, because I don't think we're anywhere near that point yet. So I just don't want to get stuck in the false binary about public, private, whatever. Happy to talk about that, but that hopefully introduces the discussion.
Two terrific speeches, which will perhaps all, I'm sure, thinking of some good questions. In a job that I did a couple of years ago, I set up a supported model employment program that is aimed at tackling long-term unemployment in public housing estates. So I'm sort of delighted, and we were very critical, I think, of the job network model in the sense of not being able to really overcome all of the significant barriers for people living in poverty, desperately wanting to get into the labour market where everyone wanted to work. So I think that was an excellent overview of the work of the committee.
We can ask you questions. You tell us what the answer.
No, I was just saying, I was so happy to hear, the terms of reference and the work that you're doing to look at all the different international and examples and change the focus a bit. But over to the audience. What we're thinking is, just getting a few questions and directing them up here. I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Sorry.
My name is Paul Flintoft. I've got a couple of declarations to make before I speak. I'm a defence lawyer, so I'm paid by the government. Not nicely enough, I'll admit. Thank the panel for their observations. I've worked in welfare law as a volunteer since 1994. I studied income support justice in the state at Flinders University and worked as a volunteer in welfare law. That welfare law put me as an executive lawyer in Centrelink 2006 to 2009. I'm a qualified lawyer from 2001. What we need to do is we really need to get Australians working. And when a department, as has been suggested, is in charge of the work for the dole program, and I've run that litigation at the Administrative Appeals Tribunal with reported decisions, if you have someone like Dr. Boxall at the head of a department that is absolutely hell-bent on people working for the dole when the program itself is not going to get people to be able to keep a job, that has a fundamental problem. So the privatisation of the system is the fundamental problem. Like I can go back to when the CES separated from Social Security and it was privatised. So unless the system is deprivatised in toto, we're going to continue to have the problem of the different nature of how different people are treated throughout the system. So I would like to encourage the current Labor government to get people working. I think that we need to start with the system that helps them to get the employment, and it needs to be on a proper basis. That's really probably my question. But to go back to Dr. Andrew Leigh's comment before about the evaluation of coffee. I had a coffee at home. I enjoyed that coffee because I'm used to making it for myself. I then had a coffee spilled on me at the coffee shop. And I think someone observed that. Someone in the front has reached around and remembers what happened. It was quite embarrassing. I didn't overreact in an overt way, but I did get my third coffee. So when you say have your coffee, I literally had my second coffee over my person, but I've had 2 coffees. That's my observation. Just be careful who gives you your coffee.
Right. Was there a question in there? So we'll take that as a sort of
a call to action question.
Yeah, no worries.
Do you agree
Thanks
with
so
me?
very much for that. And thanks for joining the Fabians today too, by the way.
Thank you.
I'll go with Adrian next. Thank you.
I'll make my declaration as well. I actually am one of those people who work for the CES, and we have a very, very engaged group of ex-CES workers who keep a very close eye on everything. And they're particularly interested in the CPSU, looking at bringing back the CES campaign. When we worked in the CES, things were very, very different. You got into the public service by doing an exam. You were given a choice of departments you liked working, and those of us who liked to help people generally chose the CES. We weren't motivated by profit, it was a free service. People who were working could list with the CES, looking for a better job, looking for a different job. They could look for part-time work, casual work, full-time work, and they weren't based on whether they were receiving income support. It was totally free. And I know you mentioned rose-coloured glasses. Those of us who looked at through those rose-coloured glasses loved it. We loved our work. We didn't work for the money, even though that was part of it, because we had to eat too. But the joy of getting people work and helping them make themselves feel better about themselves by contributing, learning skills, leading them to jobs that they loved. We literally saw people grow in front of us with their pride and with their confidence. So if they are going to bring back the CES, I can tell you there'll be thousands of ex-staffers who are putting their hands up to go back. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Adrian.
Melba?
Melba? Yeah, Melba? Or, okay, we'll go, Melba. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I'm Melba Margin, so that I'm a member of the Fabians. I've been around helping multicultural women get jobs since 30 years ago, when the CS was there. And it has been so difficult actually finding jobs, for multicultural women who come here, without much English and, all the barriers that you're talking about. So I'm just wondering, Julian, have you looked at multicultural programs, employment programs for women in your work? And have there been a lot of successes there? Because we haven't seen much in reality.
Yes, we are looking at multicultural communities that face particular barriers, particularly people newly arrived to Australia can identify a set of barriers. Two to point out are professional or beyond just functional English. So English is obviously a key success factor. If you don't have better than sort of just very basic English, then there's a very narrow part of the labour market that you're going to be able to access. But one of the other big things is networks. So if you don't have networks, and a referee to get over the phrase of death for people new to Australia, but you have no local experience, and if you're like screaming and going, well, of course I bloody don't, because I just got here, but I've got all this international experience. It's as if, we can't ring and check a referee in a different country. But the lack of networks, I'll take outside Hobart in Tasmania, 40% of jobs are never advertised. It's word of mouth, it's local, particularly in a lot of small micro businesses. So you need networks. The couple of observations I'd make would be there's some pretty compelling evidence that one of the peculiarities of where we've got to at the moment is that smaller local not-for-profits or social enterprises or little specialist services seem largely locked out of the Commonwealth system. There's a role for large case management function, but the evidence seems that we're not really, despite all the rhetoric and branding, we're not really tailoring the services very
I
well.
fully agree with you on that.
And a lot of
Because
the
that's our big problem.
Yeah.
Case management.
It's really easy politics in this to beat up on the providers. Everyone can do it. But society and governments have to take responsibility because the providers are doing exactly what we've contracted and commissioned them to do. If we don't like that, then change the system. If we want something different from the system, change the system. That's no coded message about the outcome. It's just a statement of the obvious. But yes, I think there is an issue around needing more diversity and speciality in the system, which is kind of what we'd already envisaged. But so much of the current system seems to be driven by a flawed theory of competition and by ease of Commonwealth procurement, as opposed to relating to local labour markets and regional labour markets and adapting services to communities. Some of that's messier, doesn't make Canberra's procurement job easier, but you might want to have a look at Jobs Victoria and other workarounds where they've tried reverse tender and other models to work with the Vietnamese Women's Association, put a couple of job brokers in there. They've got amazing results. So it's not sort of one or the other, but there's a whole series of groups that are locked out of helping the system now.
Especially the
Just gonna let him
localized organizations.
Yeah, we're just going to let him also.
And just one other thought that sort of maybe draws together a couple of the comments that have been made. If you're the kind of person who really wants to help people find work, then over the last 20 years, you've chosen to work for an employment services provider. So if you look at Mark Considine's book about the very best employment services providers, he actually identifies some really interesting work that's being done. Now, he acknowledges that this is the sort of very, very best of the private system, but there's also some pretty impressive human beings in that sector, as well as in the social enterprise sector, which, as Julian aptly says, is largely ignored through these private contracts and is often doing work which is sort of a combination of wraparound English language skills, sometimes cognitive behavioural therapy, sometimes other forms of support as someone comes into supported work and then ultimately uses that as a springboard into formal employment.
Fantastic. We've got someone up the back. Right up the back there. Yep.
Thank you. I'm not going to put any announcements out there where I work because I like working there. But I will say that this is formed by my personal experience and experience of not only my colleagues but my friends who do currently work for employment providers. I do not, to say that very bluntly. The fact is, at the moment, we're talking about the digital employment. It's useless. They literally sign onto a job plan and they're left there for however long until they then get put to a provider who turns around and they then all of a sudden, hey, yeah, you've now been unemployed for 3 to 6 months. We can try and help you now. It leaves that gap in their employment resume. And it's great if they are underemployed, where they actually do have a job already and not unemployed. It does work for them because they don't start getting those gaps on their resume. It is also a push to digital services within Services Australia. If you do not have technical skills, good access to a computer, good access to internet, you are left behind in the current scheme of things. It is a horrific thing that you will see people who do not have money management, all of a sudden their income is cut to what is a Centrelink payment, about $700 a fortnight, and you are having to live on that with no money skills. And particularly where we see that is where they have came from a low paying job to then Centrelink payments. So they've already came from where they didn't have a cushion of savings to nothing. They may not actually be able, if they live in a regional area, they may not be actually able to get to job interviews. they may not be able to get to their provider. Their provider will say, oh, we've got a gift card that we can give you for fuel, but you've got to get into our office together. There are all these barriers that we are seeing coming up in front of the job seekers, but we're also seeing it coming up for Services Australia staff who are trying to help and coming up against it. They will quite often have to call providers on behalf of clients because of something their provider has misunderstood. Oh, you've got a medical certificate that hasn't came across to our system. And then they have to make a phone call. Or the earnings they've put in have cancelled them off payments, and Services Australia have to go and go, no, it's a casual job, why have you put that in full time? Because of untrained staff. So yeah, it's just, there's a lot of issues there, and we do need to see them addressed effectively, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
That's a question for Julian.
I think I'm just mindful we've got 15 minutes left.
Agreed.
Yeah, I've heard all of that. That's what the inquiry is about. We've got hundreds of submissions on the website. I'll just respond to one point. One of the WTF moments during the inquiry, I think it was last October, we had a big public session with the department. It was supposed to be September, but the Queen died and everything got pushed back. So there you go. Anyway, so they flashed up on the screen. So I said, oh, well, take us through. I'm a job seeker, I sign up. And they sort of showed their digital assistants and do this and do that. And up on the screen came the jobs plan. We said, oh, let's have a look at that. It's not a bloody jobs plan. It's a cut and paste of mutual obligations from the Act. And you have to sign it or you get no social security payment. It's not a jobs plan. Like it's Orwellian. It's like if you were trying to get a friend a job, you'd think, well, what are your skills and what are your aspirations, what are your capabilities and what are your networks and who are your referees and okay, what are the jobs in your local regional labour market? Not, oh, well, if you don't do these things, we'll cut you off social security and that's your plan.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So there are very peculiar elements to the system, but it just goes back to the ideology that's driving it. And, you know, your point on the CES, most of the people I've met, these are not high-paid jobs now. They're lower paid than they used to be in the CES because they've eroded over time. Most of the people I've met in the system, they want to help people. They're still driven to go there. And a very high percentage of them leave because the latest report we caught up with Salvos last week, their national manager, they're now estimating 55% of the time of consultants is taken reporting crap into the computer for Centrelink and trying to manage the IT.
Yes.
55%, up from about, it was always about 30%, 35%. It's shocking. So, yeah.
Right. You want to say anything?
No, it's got the second question.
Okay. I'm going to move over to Julian.
Look, everyone's point, I'm finding most of the points all converge on one point, and it's about access. I mean,
Access to jobs.
Access to transport, access to money, access to that first cup of coffee in the morning. Now, people,
What was the second?
Renee's point about the poverty trap, which is so real. And this brings me back to something that's happening in Brisbane at the moment. So they're experimenting in two areas, two shows, with the social wage. Now, I think that a lot of this is cutting and pasting and doing stuff around the edge, because I've always thought that the unemployment benefits, the pensions, the carers, whatever, are all people live in poverty. They are never going to get that strap up. So I'm just wondering whether maybe we're looking at something like that, a little bit bolder, because I honestly think that countries who have a social wage seem to be doing very well. And I thought, are we thinking about it?
Thank you very much. Australia's always had a tradition of the most targeted social safety net in the world, which means that if you put $1 into the Australian social security system, it reduces inequality more than if you put $1 into any other system. If you go to Scandinavia, the benefits that the top fifth of the distribution get are not that dissimilar from the benefits to the bottom fifth of the distribution. Whereas if you look at Australia, there's a really strong skew. To take one simple example, New Zealand pays a universal pension to everyone, flat rate. Australia pays a pension based on an income and an assets test, much more targeted at those who need it. So we were able to put in place a national disability insurance scheme because we had the scope within the tax system in order to target benefits on those who need it. We certainly recognise the challenges of living on the current benefits. So the last budget increases job seeker youth allowance by $40 a fortnight, increases access to parenting payments single by raising the level at which you're cut off from your oldest child, and also increases access to the higher rate of job seeker for mature age job seekers. So we recognise those pressures, particularly in a cost of living context. And the energy bill relief that's rolling out across states and territories operates in different ways across different jurisdictions, but is generally targeted. I guess what I worry about, and this isn't really your question, but it certainly comes up from time to time, is people who say, the key to this is just to pay everyone a universal benefit. To which I say, don't give me welfare, don't give Clive Palmer welfare, don't give Jenna Reinhardt welfare. Let's keep that tradition of an Australian social safety net that is a powerhouse in reducing inequality because of its carefully targeted focus on those who most need payments.
Great, thanks Andrew. How are we going for time?
Oh, you've got 15 minutes.
Because the room's not used next. Why don't we collect questions in kind of 2 or 3?
Yeah, I think,
What have you got?
Andrew's got a plane to catch.
Okay, right.
So what are you suggesting?
Just if you collect 2 or 3 questions at a time. I'm happy to stay for another 5 or 10 if Andrew has to run off.
Yeah, I think we'll wind up.
Why don't we do questions for Andrew first?
Okay, cool. All right. So can we have a question from Andrew? For Andrew, please.
I'm happy to stay till 10 past then after Andrew goes. If that helps.
Yep.
Is that all right?
Cool.
Yeah, so it's me.
That's great.
Bruce, Paul Smith, I'm in the UK for 6 years. I worked on a public research project about public service excellence, and I thought I would make an observation and ask a question. The observation was the public have a great trust in public delivered services, and the phrase they like to hear most about supporting that was help when you need it, which might be worthwhile in terms of being. But the thing I thought I would ask you a question was, we worked over a 6-year period to develop sort of, if you like, metrics or measures of how happy people are with the service. But to put people at the centre of evaluation, processes are good, outcomes are good, but if people don't think they're being helped or getting what they need, and I was just asking your feedback on that as a metric or a measure.
Yes, absolutely, Paul. I think it's striking in the UK the love that British people have for the National Health Service. We think Australians are pretty attached to Medicare, but the NHS just rates off the charts. And I think that does reflect the way in which you can get institutions embedded, but also, as you say, the importance of making sure that we're measuring what matters. The wellbeing framework that Jim's brought down recently does try and broaden the conversation beyond GDP. That's really just something we teach first-year economics students. We teach them that economics is not about maximising money, it's about maximising well-being or happiness. So I see the measuring what matters exercise as being good public policy and sound economics at the same time. But the same questions as to what you're measuring arise in evaluations. If you've got a selection problem, so imagine that we decided to look at how happy coffee made you rather than how well it allowed you to remember Julian's remarks, then even still we would get a biased result if we compared those who chose to drink coffee with those who chose not to drink coffee. We'd be measuring a different thing, happiness rather than memory, but it would still be a flawed evaluation. If we compared decaf and regular randomly assigned, then we'd get the causal impact of caffeinated coffee on happiness. We'd be measuring something qualitative, but again, we'd be doing it through a rigorous framework, so we'd learn the true impact of caffeinated coffee on happiness.
Terrific. Thanks, Andrew. Yep.
I'm just going to talk on the perspective of an end user of social services. I was
Julian.
this country as a skilled migrant. I had the problem that you were talking about. My English is very good because I studied in UCM, University College London, and I got a master's in economics. And when I came here for 10 years, I couldn't get a job because they kept asking me for local experience and local referees, even though I could get it. And then I just did low skilled work, and then it was like, why are you doing low skilled work when you have a master's? What is wrong with you? So you're in a catch-22 situation. So that was one point. Second thing was I was put with the service providers, and it was one of the most dehumanizing things because after 5 years, they wanted me to do, and it was not me, it was 3 other people who were migrants who had, she had a master's in architecture, I have a master's in economics, and we were asked to do a course on how to approach, it was a really basic course, and basically when I said, look, this course is for school leavers, it was for after year 10 school leavers, and she said, well, you have to put some money into this course, otherwise your centering payment will not be given to you. So basically, I said, no, I'm not going to pay because this is not, so it was going backwards and forwards, and she said, you might risk losing your centering payment. So I said to her, put that in writing and give me all the reasons, and I will tell you why I don't want to do this course. Then she came back to me and said, okay, you don't have to pay, but you still have to do the course, and it was subcontracted to another person. And from what I understood was they were getting a commission for each of the person, and the government was paying for this, because if I'm not paying for it, then obviously the government, she kept saying this is a subsidized course by the government. So what I'm saying is, I was paid to, the government was paying me to do a course that was not even useful for me to find a job.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that road there.
Is there, so do you want Julian to respond to that in terms of your question? Yeah. Thanks.
You're not the first who said that.
Yeah.
There is some evidence that for some job seekers, particularly those who've been out of the labour market, what they call soft skills, employability skills, are important, and that you can improve that through various training and courses and so on. And particularly also for new migrants without those networks, often some of the practical things that you can do is not, you've got a master's degree, it's help people understand how the job market operates in Australia, what are the cultural signals to help employers look at your resume, all that sort of stuff. So it's a bit that can really help. There is an issue though that we've heard evidence on, that because of the nature and extent of the mutual obligations requirements, that too many people get pushed into doing an activity now to meet their points test for the month, which is not going to help them get a job or actively waste their time and distracts from job search and so on. So there is a balance, but the Business Council of Australia has said a number of things to us. They want to work with a redesigned system to help people get actual experience and do training for jobs that exist as opposed to training to meet points tests. So I don't think we can keep talking about that right now because we've got a few other questions, but I hope that helps.
Right, Helen?
Thank you. Helen.
Remember, any questions for Andrew too, because he's back to run.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think mine could be to either or both. My name's Helen Hill. I'm a Fabians Society member and an ALP Life member. But I currently live in Timor-Leste, and I'm just visiting for a conference actually. This really sparks off some thinking about, I worry in Timor that the discourse about development excessively depends on talking about jobs in a way that undermines people ever getting them or creating them. The discourse is undermining
the likelihood of development happening. And one of the things I continually say to people, why not use the term from the Sustainable Development Goals, decent work, instead of the term jobs, which actually comes from the International Labour Organisation. And because when you hear the word job, the team reason I mentioned so, you think you have to wait for somebody to offer you a job. When you hear the word decent work, it includes a range of activity which includes innovation, enterprise and things like this, and you sort of slightly change it. And I've just wondered if people in Australia have thought of using the word decent work, because I know Australia is supposed to follow the Sustainable Development Goals. Just a quick comment about CES. When I was an unemployed person, when my ANU scholarship ran out, I had to go on the dole. And they had a marvellous thing called the Professional Employment Service, which was really very useful for general arts graduates who don't know what sort of a job to apply for. And I found it was fantastic. So hopefully we can get something like that back.
Helen, thanks for your dedication to the Labor Party and to the Fabians. It's pretty inspiring. Decent work is obviously where we want to get to as a Labor Party, and one of the ways in which we're being impeded is the data that the Department of Employment has. They have really good data as to whether you're on benefits. They have really lousy data as to your earnings. Another part of the government, the tax office, knows what you earn, but we're yet to marry up those databases. And so this trivial sounding data issue actually ends up driving policy in really problematic ways. We end up having a work first philosophy because that's what's really easy to measure. The Department for Employment can see when you're no longer claiming benefits. It cannot so easily see whether the job you go into is a dead end or a stepping stone. It can't see whether you're on that sort of professional path that you've talked about through the CES, or whether you're simply getting by. And so one of the things I'm trying to do as an Assistant Minister with responsibility both in the employment space and also for the Australian Bureau of Statistics and in the Treasury space is to try and marry up the data a little bit better so we can actually observe the kinds of jobs people are getting. We don't get to observe everything about how they're treated and the dignity and so on, but we can observe the pay packet, which is something pretty substantial, and hopefully that gives us better evaluation. I'm going to skedaddle off to the airport. Thank you to Sarah and to the Fabians for putting on a terrific conversation.
Thanks so much, Andrew. I want to wind up now. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions. Yep, sure, I'll let you in.
Yeah, I just want to, because there's two other points that your question raised. You can go if you want, Andrew.
Yeah.
It's a reasonable critique of the current system when you strip it back that there's really only two overarching objectives. One objective is at any point in time on every day of the year and every hour of every day to drive down the dollar spend of people on social security. It's all about, that is the primary goal. That's a legitimate goal. If people can work, we want them in paid work. But the other objective is to drive down the dollar cost of running the system. And so it's yes, the data point, but I think the lack of care about that problem is because actually all that successive governments seem to have done and the contracting model is just to push people off welfare. That's kind of apparently the point. Because there's no broader public policy objectives about economic security. We don't measure it because we haven't decided it matters. So I'll just make that point. The other point is, self-employment and all those other things need to be part of the system. They kind of are. You can do it better or worse, but it's not as if it's not part of the system now. But decent work and a quality job, I think we can do more to measure that, to just move away from the work first thing that Andrew mentions. There's too many people get pushed into and stuck in very low paid, insecure, casual work, low skilled work when they have aspirations for a lot more. But because of the sort of work first, we just don't want you to claim social security, so we're not going to let you go and get your English up to a better level, or we're not going to let you go and invest in reskilling or retraining. So there's a philosophical change that's needed there. the very final thing, back to where I started, to remember this is a human service. I think we do need to review and remember that for some people in society, full-time paid employment, or indeed paid employment in the private sector labour market, is not a realistic goal. It's just not. For most people it is, it should be. For some people with barriers, we can do more to make it so. But there are some people who, because of those health issues, mental health issues, caring responsibilities, chaotic lives, some people are just unfortunately not very bright in an area that wants skilled jobs. There's just, there's all these things. Social enterprise and other forms of activity, work-like stuff, social participation is a legitimate goal for some people. So, that gives you some clues about where we're thinking.
Thanks again to our two speakers today.